Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Reason Through podcast, a show dedicated to having charitable, philosophical discussions, as well as helping you, the listener, develop and reason through your views. In this episode, I speak with Dr. Kevin Timpe. We speak on his work, Disability and Inclusive Communities. We speak with his experience on the educational system, on how it has impacted people that are disabled. We also speak about how we can do better and how we can move forward to a more inclusive society. Without further ado, I bring you Dr. Kevin Timpe. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode. Today with me, I have Dr. Kevin Timpe. Dr. Timpe, if you want to introduce yourself and kind of tell us who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I am a professional philosopher by day. I currently teach at Calvin University and teach a range of courses from some of our intro classes to metaphysics, philosophy of religion, ethics. I'm doing our philosophy of gender class this semester, which is super interesting. By night, I am a part-time disability advocate. I got started thinking about disability. Uh, Unfortunately, it took not just having a disabled father-in-law. My father-in-law lost a leg in Korea, and so has been disabled as long as I've known him. But it took having a disabled son until I started questioning some of the assumptions that sort of I had grown up with and been enculturated with. And when he was about 5, we were having some problems with his public school, and we realized that they were not doing the sorts of things that we thought they were supposed to be doing. And I was also getting ready to be on my first sabbatical. And while I had been doing a lot of work on free will up to that point, I thought, I'm ready to do something different. Maybe I should start thinking philosophically about disability. And so over the past 7 or 8 years now, I've sort of brought together these two interests in mine. But we realized that by knowing the law and by figuring out ways in which families with disabilities, disabled students had been disadvantaged by certain kinds of social structures, that we were able to make things a lot better for our own son. But I thought, it shouldn't require like everybody to do all the kinds of hard work. We're super privileged in lots of ways, right? Our kids are lucky to have a 2-parent family, um, comfortably middle class, highly educated. I've seen the gendering of some of these things go really, really problematic. And so I thought, if I can figure out how to make progress for our son, and we can also figure out how to make progress for other kids, let's do that. And so in the evenings or on the weekends or sometimes I squeeze in times to help other families think about disability and think about ways to make primarily school settings, public school settings, but sometimes church settings or just social contexts, more inclusive and more welcoming for disabled folks, because I think that our culture doesn't always do that super well.
Yeah, no, I agree. And so before we get into that topic, um, what got you into philosophy kind of to begin with? Is it something kind of you thought about when you were younger? For me, my experience was kind of I didn't start thinking about things like this till maybe, I was in college and I started taking some kind of intro to philosophy coursework. And so that kind of really got my gears going and, I haven't looked back since. But for you, what was your experience?
It is fairly similar, right? I started college as a biology and chemistry double major. I mean, in high school, I was reasonably good at the sciences and maths. And I remember thinking at the time that, like, really the only thing you can do with math is teach. And I don't want to do that. I mean, of course, it's false that that's the only thing that you can do. And so I started college as pre-med, planning on becoming a doctor, physician of some sort. And then, as part of my general education requirement, my first year of college, I had to take a philosophy class. And it was really eye-opening, as I think it often is for students, right? Here's this whole discipline that they've never heard of before. And some students, when they are made to take a discipline that they've never heard of before, think, I wish I had never heard of it in general. But for me, it was super interesting, right? It was like the opportunity to think about the kinds of questions that had just sort of been pinballing around in my head for a long time. So I get to think about like the nature of freedom. And so my interest in free will goes all the way back to my first philosophy class. I get to think about how ideas relate to the Christian faith. Um, that's really interesting, right? Sometimes youth pastors don't appreciate certain questions that teenagers have. But now I had a course where like I was not only permitted but encouraged to think about those things. So for me, it was just like, wait, I want to do that.
Yeah.
And I was just way more passionate about some of those ideas than I was about biology or chemistry, even though I still really like those. And so I've just,
Mm.
for me, the profession of philosophy in many ways has been just the opportunity to continue to think about things that I'm interested in and hopefully get other people interested in them too.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, how cool of a job really is to like you're really just thinking about things and just having conversations with people. Like I would love that. you
It's
know.
wonderful. There are two things that sometimes get in the way. There's this thing called grading, which I confess is not always my favorite. And then
Yeah.
there's these things called meetings, which also
Mhm.
sometimes aren't my favorite. Right. So the job is not ideal, but it's super fantastic, right? And so I shouldn't complain too much about either of those factors.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, my wife is a teacher, so I definitely understand. She was actually doing some grading. She was just excuse me, she just came back from spring break, and she's like, "Hey, I really got to get back on grading. I'm really behind." And I was like, "Okay." So I took my daughter and we went and played and do something while she's just doing her catching up on her work. And definitely the downside of teaching a little bit. So yeah, definitely. But anyway, I think this is a good topic or a good segue into kind of our topic, which is the purpose of you writing your book, which is something that at the beginning you stated this earlier, but also in your book you stated that you didn't set out to be someone that was an advocate for people with disabilities. That's not something you were thinking about. It's just something that kind of primarily when you had your son, and that kind of set you on that kind of path to start thinking about things about how society I guess has in some degree has had a really bad rap, or I don't know if that's a word, but has a really interesting history when it comes to people with disabilities, uh, to say the least. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, we might think that it's interesting and think that it's problematic. Though we also have to admit it's mixed, right? It's not as if like history has always been awful with respect to disabilities. So we've made progress, we've lost some progress at various times, but um, it's part of the history of. I mean, not only our country, but just sort of the larger history that I had never really thought about whatsoever.
yeah, and so I mean, definitely. So for like my background has been like in behavior analysis. So and some of the courses work we had to take, we just we for one we some of my undergrad coursework had to do with the law within like so section like 504 and IDEA, the individual and disability, I can't remember the actual act, the
Education
title of
Act.
it. Yes, and what that entails within it, just to give people equal rights to, for example, in the school setting, to have a free, appropriate education, and to be in the least restrictive environment. And so, with behavior analysis, as I'm reading some of the coursework, and some of the one of our classes was ethics, just reading some of the history that has been done, in the name of behavior analysis to, in the sense of behavior modifying people that have been diagnosed with disabilities, and just how kind of it's been very just questionable, especially about like these are human beings,
Mhm.
and why are we doing this in the first place? And so I think that's something that's I think I like about your book, because it gets you to question that a little bit. So it's like there's certain things that we're doing in society that we're not really thinking about. Earlier you're talking about kind of the lighting, and it's better for people to might certain lighting. I think how you worded it was it's better for people to read lips if that's something that they are used to or something that they need to do. And so, but just something like that, you're not really thinking about all these little other factors that are kind of involved that we're actually doing, kind of without really thinking about it, and that impacts a certain group. So, yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think culturally there are a whole range of assumptions that we often don't think about, right? I love to teach David Foster Wallace's "This Is Water." It's a commencement address he gave at Kenyon College, and it starts off with these two fish swimming, and another fish comes up and says, "Hey guys, how's the water?" And one fish turns to the other and is just like, "What the hell's water?" Right. So the whole point is that like there's this whole range of things that we take so much for granted that we never question it. And those of us that didn't grow up disabled, didn't grow up sometimes with direct family members who are disabled, don't have jobs that make us think about disability, right? For a lot of us, sort of like all these assumptions about what bodies ought to be like, the ways in which we structure, kind of, right? This is all just part of our water, and so when I started thinking about disability, again, it was sort of this two part. Like our son was going through, we just figured out that the public school he went to at the time was just violating, 30-year-old federal law, like
Hmm. Hmm.
all over the place. But I was also starting this academic project to think about disability, and I was learning all of these things in sort of the academic study that I thought lots of people, might benefit from knowing. Um, but like aunts and uncles, or even my parents, or various kinds of, right, they're not going to read academic stuff. I mean, I love my parents, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe my dad has read some of my academic work. My dad was a psychology faculty for a long time, right? So I just started thinking, like, what do I wish the people around me knew about disability so that they could just start thinking in slightly better ways? And so I set out at one point to like put together this book, and I thought about it as like everything that I wish the general public knew about disability.
Mhm.
And it started to get really, really long,
Mm.
and really, really complicated. And then when I came to Calvin, the Calvin Press has this series of just really short books. And they're intended to be written at about a ninth or 10th grade audience. They're supposed to be the kind of thing that you could read in an hour and a half long uh, plane plane ride, or in an afternoon at the beach or something like that. And I was approached by the editor for the press and just said, "Hey, I've seen," she said, "I've seen some of your work. I want you to do one of these." And I thought, oh well, like if what I want to do is to write a book that the general public is going to read, I shouldn't think about it in terms of a 400-page what I wish everybody knew. And so that basically became the disability and inclusive community short little book, that you're asking about. And so for me, this is in a sense kind of a public outreach book. Um, uh, an opportunity to get people to think about and maybe question some of the assumptions that they've had about disabilities. I think that lots of these assumptions are really deeply baked into how we think as a society, how we do things like education, how we do things like building design, how we do things like social interaction, how we do right. Like I mean, all parts of our social lives together, I think, like make certain assumptions, and often those assumptions, if left unquestioned, are going to disadvantage people or leave them behind, and it's going to do it in a way that we don't intend for it to do it. Right? We don't seek to construct classroom environments that are going to exclude people with disabilities. We just do things the way that they've been done, and we end up excluding people with disabilities. And so the purpose of the book, in a sense, is just to sort of like to lift the veil a little bit, not to have the final word, but just to get people interested in like, oh yeah, maybe this is more important than I had thought it was. And there are ways in which we do things together that end up harming people, that we don't want to harm. And actually, maybe that kind of harm is bad for the whole community and not just the disabled folks that we're actively or passively discriminating against.
Yeah, 100%. So something like in the like, let's kind of take one little topic. So something like the school system, right? So if you want to kind of explain a little bit about kind of your experience that has been within the school system, either people or pushbacks or things that, maybe the general population just may not really understand about how it's kind of discriminating against people that have been diagnosed with disabilities.
Yeah. So our son, and again, this is connects back to the autobiography of how we got interested. And again, looking back, like I so wish it hadn't have taken this kind of personal connection for me to see the importance here, but it did. And I think that's how it is for lots of us. But our son has been in some kind of therapy or other basically since he was just weeks old. Initially some physical therapy, and then physical and OT and speech and all kinds of different stuff. And there's the different states do this slightly different. There is this overarching Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that you mentioned that was passed in 1990. But it was based on an earlier law, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of, I think, 1976, which was the first federal law that required states to have public education for disabled students. And when it was passed, I don't remember the exact detail, but approximately half of the states did not have formal public education opportunities for disabled students. And so the law was initially passed in 1976, been updated a few times, updated again in 1990. And it allows for this sort of child fine system where even before the kindergarten age, if a school district becomes aware of a child with a disability, they can start doing certain kinds of interventions and therapies through the school district. Um, and so as we got our son into various therapy programs, we found out about these. We did that. He's getting ready to start kindergarten. We just sort of like, hey, what do we do? And they said, well, this is the elementary school that he's going to go to, and it kind of puzzled us because our neighborhood, a block away, like we could look out at the back of our house and see a public school, and they wanted to bus him from our house a couple of miles to this other school. But we thought, all right, I guess that's what you do. So we signed up. Um, uh, he did his entire kindergarten year there. He was off with a number of other disabled students in what in Idaho was called the extended resource room, the special education room, or the pull-out room. The terminology varies by state and district. And we thought, like, hey, they're doing a decent job for him. Like, okay. Started first grade. Our son's best friend had Down syndrome, and we were fairly good friends with the parents. And so my spouse and one of the parents of our son's best friend went to a local Down syndrome uh, event, where the event was to sort of like give families the basics of the law. And I remember that my spouse and our friend came back and they were just weeping after this meeting. They walked in the house, the kids were asleep at that time, and I just remember like, that went badly if you're both in tears when you came back. And they just discovered that like the school was failing them in all sorts of ways. The school was not trying to include them with non-disabled children. Mm-hmm. The school district was busing them past the school that was right next to our neighborhood to this other school. And I'm an academic. I don't like my spouse to cry and be upset. I don't like to be angry. And so I just thought, like, I need to figure out some more stuff. And so downloaded the state disability manual, the Idaho special education rules or something like that. And I just started reading it, and I became just like completely shocked, right? You mentioned free appropriate public education, technical term that's in that law. So the idea of FAPE, free and appropriate public education, is it's supposed to be in the least restrictive environment. It's supposed to be in the environment that is as close to what the average educational experience is, that would be accessible, right, in terms of the location or the contents by the student. So you always have to have a reason to take a disabled student out of that, right, the regular environment. The default is always in the regular environment. And the law also says, even if the child can't be working on the same material, right, it just means that they need to be in the least restrictive environment where they can work on what their educational goals are, even if they're different from what the general education content was. Mm-hmm. And this was just completely foreign to our experience. And so I read it, and again, I'm an academic. I'm fairly used to making arguments. Just figured out what they were doing violated the law. We wrote down how it violated the law. We went to the school board. We made some arguments. We went into we called for a new meeting for our son's educational placements. Any student with a diagnosed disability that affects their education in a public school has what's called an IEP, an individual education plan of how the services are going to be provided. We said the old one sucked. We want a new one. We knew how to call for one. And we went in and we argued, and we got things changed. It took a couple of years, right? Change comes slowly to institutions. But our son went from complete pullout. Well, they said he is with his non-disabled peers. They all eat in the same lunchroom, and they go to recess at the same time. And he goes to PE with them, right? But there was like no attempt to have any educational content with his peers. They were just taking all the disabled kids and putting them in one room because it's easier to do education that way.
Hmm.
We said, you're not going to do that. And so over the course of a few years, we got him put into the general education environment more. We eventually got it changed so that he could go to the school that we could see from our house. Because by that time, his sister was getting ready to go to school, and we wanted our kids to go to the same school. And we just thought, like, not only our daughter, but our son should be able to go to the school with the kids in the neighborhood, not have to go, a different part of town.
Yeah.
And we were able to get a lot of changes made for our son. We also then realized that, in part because of uh, his friend, whose mom went to all these meetings with him, the dad in that family, a good friend of mine, had debilitating migraines, and so he wasn't able to do some of this advocacy work in person for their own son. But when I read the law, I realized that parents of disabled children are allowed to take advocates. So I just said, "Hey, invite me to your meeting,"
Mhm.
and then I could go and I could help her. And then just as sort of we got to know other folks, I remember once our son, both our son and his friend played in this flag football league where half the kids were disabled, half the kids weren't. Sometimes it was great; you couldn't tell who were the disabled kids and who weren't the disabled. It was a lovely league. Shout
Nice.
out to Gabe Moreno and all his partners there in Boise for that league. But after the game, my spouse came up to me and was like, while the game was going on, I was talking to this other parent and they're having some of the same problems. You need to help them too. And I remember thinking, like, you know what? I can help them. It'd be helpful if I had business cards. So we came home, we put the kids to bed, and I printed up business cards, right? And since then, we've become incorporated, got nonprofit status, and so now when I can, I just sort of work with folks, either locally or sometimes just over the phone or email to figure out how to push back on schools.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. And they can be very unaccommodating at times. I'm talking about the school districts.
yeah,
Uh, and it's definitely so and so important for parents, right? To have that education or to have someone like you as yourself, right? That is kind of giving them the ins and outs of the law. And so when things are being violated, they can speak up for themselves and know their rights. Because that's super important. Because at the end of the day, as far as an institution goes, the goal should be, at least one of the goals should be that how are they going to meet the kid? How are they going to meet the needs of their students?
yep,
Uh, Regardless of they're disabled or not disabled. And
yep.
that's the primary goal. Then they are, kind of they're violating that goal and doing something that's essentially breaking the law, but also unethical, and a disservice to human beings in general.
Yeah,
So
it's a disservice to the disabled students, but it's also a disservice, I think, to the able-bodied students. I mean, I think that disabled students, like disabled people in general, have a lot to offer. And so, if you are not giving non-disabled individuals the opportunity to learn from and engage with and be friends with disabled people, right, you're doing them a disservice too. So, the way that the law is written is supposed to benefit everybody. Um, but we figured out that even the people whose job is to like live up to the law,
hmm.
right, often don't know what the law is. In one of the first meetings we went to, I remember that one of our son's therapists, right, his school therapist, whose job is to provide OT or PT services to him, when I said something about what Idaho state law required, she just said, "I don't know what you're talking about." She didn't know that there was a state special education manual that like constrained and set the parameters for her entire job. Even just last week, I was talking with a social worker that's on part of our son's team here in Idaho. And I made a fairly basic point that we've already talked about, how the default is always supposed to be in the general education setting. And
Hmm.
you have to justify every time that you're going to remove a disabled student from that setting. And the school social worker said, well, like, the law better than I do. I trust you when you say that. And I was thinking, it's really strange to me that the very people that are supposed to do the things, right, that the law says often aren't familiar with it.
Yeah.
And so what I've come to learn here is, I think, an important point. You like I don't think that. So I've had lots of frustrations with teachers. I've had lots of frustrations with therapists, but I don't think that they're bad people, right? Like, they're not trying to be exclusionary.
Mm-hmm.
It's just they haven't been trained by their districts to know what the law is and how to do stuff better. You can have a social system that, like, you don't intend to leave out folks, but because you haven't questioned the water, because you haven't questioned the assumptions about the practices that we do, ends up being exclusionary,
Mm-hmm.
right? It ends up being the kind of thing that, once it's pointed out, and sometimes pointed out that it's illegal, suddenly people care about. And
Yeah.
it'd be great to not have to do that, but unfortunately, that's not the world that we live in. And so, if I have to be the person to point that out to make things a little bit better, well, I guess I'll do it.
Yeah. So just there's a couple points that I want to address. One is that going back to how the non-disabled people are losing out, at least I would say majority, they're losing out on really profound relationships that they can have with people that are disabled. And so something like with me growing up, and I think this is my parents' generation and probably past generations before. Anytime a disabled person would be walking, and I would just look or be curious about what's going on there. As a kid, you're kind of curious almost about everything, like why is this person like that, or what's going on here. My parents always like, oh, don't look, don't stare, just kind of keep on going on your business. And so that kind of created my mindset of me to where I lost out, at least within school and in high school, where I never associated with my peers, and as a result of that, I had that mindset. And so it wasn't until I started working in the school system and I became an instructional assistant. So I was working primarily in an autism program, and from there, I developed a lot of rich relationships that I had with the students, to the point where I became a one-on-one with one student, and not I wasn't with him his entire high school career, but I was with him till he graduated, and we went to Blackbeard's one time, and we just went on the go karts together. We were playing basketball together. I went to his grad party, and just had he is this person, one of the best relationships I've ever had with a person, and just so enriching in my life. And so it's just a really something that you don't think about within the school
Mhm.
system, that they're not either encouraging things like that to come together, or even have clubs, something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just there's things that are missing out on those things, and so yeah.
And again, I think this shows that, like, we don't have to mean to teach our children that, like,
Yeah.
to stay away from disabled folks, right? But children pick up on the, oh shoot, don't look, or don't talk
Hmm.
to them, or right, don't stare, and they recognize, right, that they're trained. Our kids are being trained that, like, disability isn't something that we address. So then we don't know how to address it, and when we don't know how to address something, we just, right, like, pretend that it's not there.
And
But
avoid it.
pretending disability is not there just means pretending that the disabled people aren't there. And
Yeah.
so this encourages this kind of out of sight, out of mind mentality that actually, I mean, in some of our history, right, that's exactly the push for institutionalization, right? And we
Yeah.
don't institutionalize in quite the same way that we used to, but we still have this functional divide between non-disabled folks and disabled folks. And unless, because the structures sort of reinforce the status quo, unless we call that into question, um, it's going to perpetuate itself.
Yeah, and that's something you also bring up in your book, and it's kind of like a little bit of history in that is like the medical model of disability, to where something's wrong with them, there's something to be fixed with them, and it's kind of that kind of top-down process to where now you have generations, right? Like my parents' generation, maybe, and a little bit of with me when I was growing up, to where there's something wrong with them, kind of they're people to be pitied rather than to be accepted, and it's very bizarre. But it's kind of that little bit of the history behind the medical model of disability.
Yeah, I remember I had our son at the grocery store once, and I mean, my life is, we've got 4 kids, or sorry, 3 kids. Father-in-law lives with me. We got a dog. We got 3 cats, right? Like, life is pretty full. And so often when I'm at the grocery, right, like I want to get my groceries, I want to get back home and like do one of the other 73 things on my to-do list for the day.
Mhm.
But our son has some mobile, or I mean, he walks, but he's got some motor control issues, so he doesn't walk super fast. And our local grocery store has these wonderful, they're called Caroline's carts. They're a kind of grocery cart that uh, like bigger children can like climb into because they've got like a seat built
Mhm.
into it where you're not lifting them up over and putting them in the little seat where like 3-year-olds often go. And so I was using that at the end of the day. Our son was tired, and I remember I was like in the cereal aisle, and I passed somebody, and somebody, she just said, "Hey, that's an interesting cart," and I'm like, "Yeah, these are great." And her next question was, "Well, what's wrong with your son?"
Mhm.
And I was pretty frustrated. And I remember my thought was like, and I don't think that I actually said this, though maybe I did. Something like, "Well, what's wrong with my son is he lives in a culture where you think that's the proper response, right?" And this sort of illustrates the what you've called the medical model. This idea that disability is a bad medical condition. Uh, it's a function of individual bodies, and the proper response is always to try to fix if possible and like eliminate if possible, right? Which is
Mhm.
a nice eugenic push there,
Mhm.
um, to like sort of fix that thing so that our society can keep going on. And that's often contrasted with the social model, right? Where what disables folks isn't necessarily facts about their body, but the way that we treat people with bodies like that in our social environment. Um, the disability rights movement picked up and pushed for like the curb cutouts, right?
Yeah.
And ramps. If we change our environment, sometimes the exclusion that disability has, because people can't get into the kinds of things that the rest of us can get into, right? That's the real problem, not a problem with the bodies to be fixed. But again, our schools are kind of like that, right? Like special educate, I confess I don't like the phrase special education because right, special is often like a euphemism for bad in some kind of
Mhm.
way. Like, oh,
Mhm.
isn't she special? Oh, your son's got special. Like all these phrases kind of irk me. But special education is a legal term too, and so I've sometimes use it in my writing. But if we think about right, there's nothing necessarily special about education for disabled students. Just like how we try to accomplish what education is for might need to be a little bit different. And so it's different in terms of its modality and the kinds of concerns that we need to have, not what the purpose of it is. But if
Mhm.
we think about special education as something over here and
Mhm.
education for other folks, regular education,
Mhm.
right, is over here, then we perpetuate that kind of exclusion. We keep kids from having the benefit of having friends, right, because they're kept somewhere else. Um, and then what happens is kids like that who grow up not being around disabled kids, right? I mean, this was me. Even looking back, though the initial federal rights Special Education Act, the Handicap for All Disabled or Education for All Handicapped Children Act, passed the year after I was born. But like, I don't remember having any disabled kids anywhere in my elementary, middle, or high school experience. I suspect because we were violating the law as a public school district.
Yeah.
But if kids grow up like I did, then we don't know how to think about disability, and we think that we don't need to think about disability. And then some of us that haven't had to think about disability end up having kids that are disabled. And
Yeah.
that's it's kind of jarring, right? Like trying to figure out how to parent is hard enough.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out how to parent a child that a lot of the regular advice doesn't apply to
Mhm.
is hard. And so a lot of times what parents initially do is they turn to the people that seem to be the experts. We turn to the doctors and the therapists, but those are the ones that reinforce the social model. Right. At one point, our son was doing some therapies that I now recognize were part of ABA therapy, applied behavioral analysis. And what what some autistics do is they engage in certain kinds of behaviors, self-stimulatory behaviors or stimming behaviors,
Mhm.
right? Or sometimes they flap their hands, or they just, they they do repetitive motions that a lot of us aren't comfortable with.
Mhm.
And parts of therapy were like trying to train our son to not do those sorts of things.
Yeah.
But come to learn from talking with autistic friends now and reading books by autistics that those kinds of repetitive behaviors, that kind of stimming, is a way to sort of right navigate what's often an overwhelming
Mhm.
sensory situation.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
those of us that don't know any better because we've never had to think about it and haven't had any disabled autistic friends that help us think about this,
Mhm.
default to listening to the experts. The experts
Mhm.
tell us to do something which reinforces there's something wrong with our kids.
Mhm.
And the thing that we end up doing is probably actually counterproductive,
Mhm.
right? And so if we can get other folks to have conversations and engagements and deep friendships with disabled people, right? This is going to solve lots of problems. It's going to help us figure out how to be better parents. It's
Yeah.
going to help, right, teachers better understand how to serve some of their students. It's going to address the real social isolation that lots of disabled folks have. It's going to give them new opportunities, right? And so, really, we're all going to be better off if we've got a better sense of the value and the contribution that disabled folks can bring to our communities.
Yeah. And it's like, why aren't we listening to these voices? That's another problem, you know.
Yep.
And I agree with you. One of the things within behavior analysis, my little short time within some clinics to where I was working in a clinic before, and yeah, they were wanting to stop some of that behavior. And I always thought, why does it matter? I mean, that's like I don't care. Like, or I don't think this should matter. How much? And the way I look at it is like it's like, okay, there's why can't we normalize things like this? Like, what difference does it really make? There was a student who would do that behavior, the stimulatory behavior, like for buses. And to me, it's just like I'll stand out here with you all day and to have you watch buses because that's what you want to do. And who to me, it's like I don't care. Like that's who you are too. It's so I in my mind, it's like why are we trying to stop something like this? And why can't we just normalize things like this because it's not really hurting anyone, and that's just kind of what they want to do or what they need to do in some cases. So
Yeah, and I think that part of the water, to continue this David Foster Wallace metaphor, right, is we just expect people to be a certain kind of way. And these people strike us as strange. They strike us
mm,
as right intimidating sometimes or scary at times. And so what we end up doing with at least some disabilities is we basically train people to pretend they're not disabled.
yeah,
Right? We expect them to pass, and not all disabilities can do that, right? If somebody is a paraplegic, it's not as if they can pass as ambulatory, but we especially expect autistics to pass, right? There's a parallel here, I think, about mental health, right? We expect depressed folks to pass as like non-depressed in various kinds of ways. And that ends up backfiring, right, in all sorts of ways, ends up being harmful. But until we learn to listen to the folks that have been through this themselves, then right, we're often going to listen to the very kinds of social structures and social right people with social capital that have benefited from not being disabled themselves, and often right reinforce some of these bad stereotypes or bad assumptions or bad models that we've been talking about.
yeah. One thing too that you we haven't touched upon yet, and I would like to touch upon it before our time is up, is you mentioned a little bit within the church as well, how churches can be exclusionary, and kind of what we can do about what you guys can do about making it more inclusive to everyone.
Yeah, and so with respect to all the advocacy work that we've done in public schools, right? We have like the law on our side, right? Like that became the lever, the fulcrum that we could push back on. But churches are actually exempt from not only the public education laws, but they're actually formally exempt from the ADA because they campaigned to be exempt from the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, when it was passed in 1990. But if you think about the nature of the church, right, the church is supposed to be an environment that is there to bring people together, to unify them as the body of Christ, to participate in the strengthening and upbuilding of God's people, and to go out and do certain kinds of service, right? To engage in God's self-giving activity out there in the world. And all of those are things that presumably disabled folks can do too. They also deserve to be the recipients of that.
Hmm.
Um, and so churches are one of these places where, unfortunately, I think uh, end up being worse than sort of the culture at large, which, in my view, is already fairly problematic. Um,
Hmm.
Eric Carter and some of his team at Vanderbilt have done great work about the some of the demographic reasons why disabled families with disabled individuals are less likely to go to church. And when
Hmm.
church, and again, I think that churches don't mean to be
Hmm.
exclusionary,
Hmm.
and sometimes you can get a church to oh wait, yeah, we look around, right? Approximately 20% of the U.S. population has a disability. We don't seem to have 20% of our church with a disability. Maybe we're doing something wrong. Like the old folks, a lot of them have some hearing issues, or maybe we've got one blind member or something like that. But often then what churches do is they think, okay, well, we need to start a disability ministry. And disability ministry is almost always disability ministry, or sorry, a ministry specifically towards disabled children. And there are two problems as I see it with that being the first thought. Is one, it reinforces this idea that disabled children and regular children are two fundamentally different camps.
Hmm.
But it also leaves out disabled adults.
Hmm.
Um, and as my dear friend Carlisle has told me, you know what disabled kids almost always grow up to be? Disabled adults.
Hmm.
And if you're the kind of person that doesn't yourself have any disabled friends, you're modeling to your kids that they don't need disabled friends either. And churches are in, especially his experience, and now as I've started to think about it, my experience too, are often these kinds of environments. And so, what I think churches often need to do is to think about not starting a new ministry. Right? There might be contexts in which that's the proper response. But the first thing that they should do is what are we doing to not let disabled folks, not just disabled kids, but disabled adults too,
Yeah.
not feel welcome in all these other things that we're doing? What is it about the way that we structure our events, our services that leave them out? And often it's not anything official, it's just the way that we treat folks, right? And it comes back to this: we don't know how to interact with disabled folks. And so we end up doing things that unintentionally make them feel unwelcome. And that's right. That's not the church being the church.
Yeah. I There's this one experience that I had. So back in my undergrad, I took a theology of disability class, and the teacher, she was a former school psychologist, but she was going to one of the churches that was local here, and she told me a story about one of the parents, and I actually knew the student, and I guess she had made a phone call to this parent, and her intent was to talk about her son, and like what better ways they could like structure their the church or a program. I forgot what they were trying to do, but how could they better serve his her son? And she was telling us, the class, um, her first response, the mom's response was, "I thought you were going to call me because we have gotten plenty of calls from churches telling us not to come back. I thought you were going to call us and tell. I thought you were going to call me and tell me not to come back." Because we have gotten that response from, I'm not sure how many other churches they had gone to. Uh, and that just, yeah, I mean, I know the student, and I'm just like, I mean, it's very disheartening, and I just almost broke my heart. And she's like trying to tell her, um, tell the mom that no, that's not like our intent. Like that's not what we want to. We want to work with you. We want to do things, you know. And so to help you, you know, be successful and to help you feel welcomed. And yeah, I think mom broke down in tears, but uh, yeah, it's just getting that responses from the church, which in my mind kind of is surprising, and then it's also not surprising, you know. So
Yeah, I mean, I used to be surprised by stories like that, and now I'm not at all. And I do think that that kind of response is still probably the minority response. Like, uh, I mean, I hope that's the minority response.
Hmm.
I mean, it happens every time that it happens is one time too many. But I think often what happens is churches will like officially say we want to be welcoming, but they don't know how to do it. And then
Yeah.
they end up doing all these sort of small things that make it clear that you're not welcome, right? So imagine there's somebody with a disability, and it happens to be a disability that like makes it difficult for them to sit still for long periods of time or to be super quiet, right? There's all kinds of different disabilities that might be involved here. But think
Hmm.
about the ways that some of our churches, like the way that the worship service itself is structured, right? Like you're sitting for long periods of time, maybe you stand up, you sit back down, right? There's very rigid expectations about the amount of noise that's allowed. Of course, that's exclusionary to families with young kids too. You don't have to tell a family that you're not welcome back. You just have to like enough people give them the look, right? Like
Hmm.
when their disabled family member is making too much noise or something like that, during the song, or you just you show people that they're not really welcome when disabled adults don't have anybody that talk to them after the
Yeah.
service.
Yeah.
And they come in, they participate as a visitor, and they have that sort of awkward, like post church, who's going to talk to me? And like,
Hmm.
right, people are uncomfortable about a disability, and so nobody talks to them. Like, well, okay, I was here. It didn't matter even enough for somebody to say we are glad you were there. I guess they
Hmm.
really don't care, right? So again, there's lots of ways that we send that message: you and your family aren't welcome, even if we don't literally call them and say, by the way, you and your family aren't welcome.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be malicious, right? It just has to be the kind of thing that we do, even unreflectively, but people get that message.
And this kind of brings full circle to your work, which is to get this kind of these voices, your voice out there, and to kind of empower some voices, so they can improve their quality of life and to, essentially, which is mind-boggling to me because we're in the 21st century, uh, why they're not equal already. Like there's that stigma behind it, and just
Mhm.
the marginalization and the kind of what you're talking about. Because it's something that I didn't even think about too. Like, wait, growing up in the school, it's like, yeah, well, yeah, that's special education. This is general education. But what makes it kind of like questioning kind of what makes it special? It's just education, but geared towards individuals that are disabled. So what? Why do we need to kind of um, categorize it? Right? It just kind of reinforces this structural um, discrimination, I guess, or just your
Structural discrimination in some cases, just structural exclusion in others,
yeah,
or just structural indifference, right? I mean, that's bad enough.
yeah. So, well, we're coming up to the hour. You've been plenty generous with your time, and so is there a way for people to get in contact with you? If you want to leave people with that information, I'll definitely leave links in the description to so people can find you, and also to your book.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me, Jacob. I mean, the easiest way to find me is you can go to my website, which is just kevintimpe.com, or you can email me at kevin.timpe, Timpe, at gmail.com, is sort of the best non-academic email address that folks can find me at. But if people have further questions or they're interested in various sorts of things, or even like um, uh, want to follow up on pushing back against a school, or just thinking about their church or something like that, I would welcome contact and try to help out. And again, appreciate you having me. I appreciate what you're doing, and it's been a fun time.
Yeah, thank you. And that concludes another episode of the Reason Through podcast. If you find value in what I'm doing, please consider subscribing, rating, reviewing the podcast, as it shows your support, and I would greatly appreciate it. See you next time.